The Cursed Childhood of Margaret Theresa, Spain's inbred princess. The 5-year-old girl in the center of the painting couldn't close her mouth properly because her jaw jutted out so far that her teeth didn't meet. Margaret Theresa of Spain stood, frozen in Diego Velázquez's masterpiece, her pale blue eyes bulging slightly from their sockets, her Habsburg jaw already showing the curse that would kill her at 21. The blonde princess wore a dress worth more than a mansion, but underneath the silk and jewels, her body was already breaking down from centuries of uncle-niece marriages. This was the child who would become Holy Roman Empress, painted in Velázquez. Menina's in 1656, the most famous portrait ever created. She looked like a doll because she basically was one, a genetic disaster dressed in diamonds, created by a family so obsessed with keeping power that they'd been marrying their own relatives. For 200 years, the little girl staring out from the canvas had parents who were uncle and niece, grandparents who were first cousins, and a family tree that looked more like a family stick. But Margaret Theresa wasn't just another royal child. She was the last hope of the Spanish Habsburg dynasty, the final attempt to produce an heir before the bloodline collapsed completely. What nobody in that painting knew was that this princess was already dying, her body poisoned by generations of inbreeding so severe that modern geneticists can't believe she lived past infancy. Her father, King Philip IV of Spain, had already buried 11 children. His first wife was his niece. His second wife was also his niece. Margaret Theresa's mother, Mariana of Austria, was both Philip's niece and his second cousin. The king was literally his daughter's great-uncle and cousin. At the same time, this wasn't unusual for the Habsburgs. It was their official policy. The Habsburg family had been marrying each other since 1450. They controlled half of Europe through strategic marriages, but they'd gotten so paranoid about keeping their bloodline pure that they stopped marrying anyone outside the family. By the time Margaret Theresa was born in 1651, her ancestors had been recycling the same DNA for so long that she had fewer unique great-great-grandparents than most people have fingers. But that wasn't even the worst part. Margaret Theresa's genome was so scrambled that she inherited multiple copies of the same deadly gene. Modern DNA analysis shows she had an inbreeding coefficient of 0.254, meaning 25.4% of her DNA was identical from both parents. For comparison, children of first cousins have a coefficient of 0.0625. Margaret Theresa was 4 times more inbred than that. The real horror was still coming. When Margaret Theresa was born on July 12, 1651, the doctors noticed immediately that something was wrong. Her head was too large for her body. Her jaw protruded so far that she would never be able to chew food properly. Her skin had a strange, translucent quality that made her look like she was made of porcelain. The court physicians wrote that she seemed delicate beyond measure. What those physicians didn't write down was that Margaret Theresa couldn't digest milk properly as a baby. She vomited constantly and had chronic diarrhea that left her severely dehydrated. The palace staff had to change her bedding 6 times a day because she couldn't control her bowels. Her nursemaids mixed her food with wine and honey just to get calories into her body. The Spanish court tried to hide her health problems, but the symptoms were impossible to ignore. By age 3, Margaret Theresa still couldn't walk without assistance. Her legs were too weak to support her body weight. The court blamed it on her heavy dresses, but other princesses her age could run and play. Margaret Theresa had to be carried everywhere by servants, but the truly disturbing part was what happened when she tried to eat. The Habsburg jaw wasn't just ugly, it was functionally disabling. Margaret Theresa's lower jaw extended so far past her upper jaw that she couldn't bite or chew. Every meal had to be cut into tiny pieces and placed far back in her mouth. She often choked on her food because she couldn't control it with her tongue. The court developed special utensils just for her. Silver spoons with extra long handles to reach past her protruding jaw. Cups with special spouts that could pour liquid directly down her throat. Even with these modifications, Margaret Theresa took over an hour to eat a simple meal. Courtiers pretended not to notice when food fell from her mouth onto her expensive dresses. What happened next changed everything about how Europe viewed royal marriages. When Margaret Theresa turned 4, her father started receiving marriage proposals from across the continent. Every royal family wanted to marry into the Spanish Habsburgs because they controlled the silver mines of South America. The Spanish Empire was producing 150 tons of silver every year, making it the richest nation on earth. But there was a problem. Everyone could see that Margaret Theresa was sick. Foreign ambassadors sent coded messages back to their kings describing the princess's appearance. The French ambassador wrote that she looked like a ghost child with skin so pale you could see her veins. The English ambassador was more direct. The princess appears unlikely to survive to adulthood. King Philip IV knew these reports were destroying his daughter's marriage prospect. He ordered Velázquez to paint Margaret Theresa in 1656 specifically to create propaganda showing her as a healthy, normal child. The painting that became Las Meninas was supposed to be a marriage advertisement, proving that the princess was suitable for breeding. The real horror was still coming. While Velázquez painted Margaret Theresa as a beautiful child surrounded by servants and wealth, the princess was suffering from constant pain. Her joints hurt so badly that she cried when anyone touched her. Her bones were growing incorrectly because of genetic defects. Her right leg was slightly longer than her left, causing her to walk with a pronounced limp. The court physicians tried everything to cure her. They bled her with leeches to balance her humors. They made her drink mercury mixed with gold dust. They rubbed her joints with oil made from boiled puppies. They even tried hanging her upside down for hours to straighten her spine. Nothing worked because the problem was in her DNA. But that wasn't even the worst part. Margaret Theresa's mental development was also affected by inbreeding. She had difficulty learning to read and write. Her tutors reported that she would forget lessons from one day to the next. Simple mathematical concepts were beyond her grasp. The court blamed her tutors and kept hiring new ones, but the problem was neurological damage from genetic defects. The Spanish court developed an elaborate system to hide her disability. They assigned her 12 ladies-in-waiting, whose only job was to whisper answers to her during public appearances. They created special picture books with simple symbols because she couldn't read text. They even hired actors to pretend to be foreign ambassadors so she could practice conversations before meeting real diplomats. What nobody realized was that Margaret Theresa's problems were about to destroy the entire Spanish Empire. Her father had no surviving sons. Her older sister had died at age 1. Her younger brother Carlos would be born so deformed that he couldn't walk or talk. Margaret Theresa was the only child who seemed capable of producing an heir, so the entire future of Spain depended on her broken body. The marriage negotiations became desperate. Philip IV lowered the dowry requirements. He offered entire provinces as wedding gifts. He even promised to pay for the wedding in gold bars shipped directly from Peru. Finally, in 1663, when Margaret Theresa was 12, he found a groom willing to overlook her obvious disabilities. Her uncle, Leopold. Leopold V was Holy Roman Emperor, ruler of Austria, Hungary, and half of Germany. He was also Margaret Theresa's mother's brother, making him both her uncle and her first cousin once removed. The marriage contract specified that any children would inherit both Spain and Austria, creating a superpower that would control most of Europe. But the real horror was what happened on the wedding night. Margaret Theresa was 12 years old. Leopold was 23. The court physicians examined her before the wedding and reported that she had not yet reached puberty. Her body was so malnourished from her digestive problems that her reproductive system hadn't developed normally. The physicians recommended waiting, but politics demanded immediate consummation. The wedding took place by proxy in 1663. Margaret Theresa married a portrait of Leopold while he married a portrait of her. The actual meeting wouldn't happen until 1666, when she was old enough to travel. The 3-year delay was supposedly for her education, but palace records show it was really because she was too sick to survive the journey. What happened next was even worse. During those 3 years, Margaret Theresa's health deteriorated rapidly. She started having seizures that left her unconscious for hours. Her digestive problems got so bad that she could only eat soup and mashed vegetables. Her menstrual cycle never properly started, coming sporadically and causing extreme pain that left her bedridden for weeks. The Spanish court tried increasingly desperate treatment. They brought in faith healers who claimed they could cure genetic defects with prayer. They made her wear amulets made from the bones of saints. They even tried feeding her powdered unicorn horn, which was actually narwhal tusk selling for more than gold. Nothing helped because 16th century medicine couldn't fix corrupted DNA, but that wasn't even the worst part. In 1665, Margaret Theresa's father died, leaving her 14-year-old brother Carlos as king of Spain. Carlos was so inbred that he made Margaret Theresa look healthy. He couldn't speak until age 4. He couldn't walk until age 8. His jaw protruded so far that he couldn't chew at all and had to swallow his food whole like a pelican. The Spanish succession was now in total crisis. Carlos obviously couldn't produce heirs. Court physicians later confirmed he was sterile and possibly intersex. Margaret Theresa was the only hope for continuing the bloodline, but she had to survive long enough to have children. The pressure on her to reproduce became crushing. Finally, in 1666, Margaret Theresa traveled to Vienna to meet her husband. The journey took 4 months because she had to stop every few hours to rest. She traveled with 30 wagons full of medical supplies, including opium for her pain, mercury for her seizures, and cocaine leaves to give her energy. Her entourage included 6 physicians who worked in shifts to keep her alive. When Leopold finally saw his bride, witnesses reported that he couldn't hide his shock. The pretty child from Velázquez's painting had become a 15-year-old who looked simultaneously like a child and an old woman. Her growth had been stunted by malnutrition. Her face was gaunt from constant illness. Her famous blonde hair had started falling out in clumps. But the wedding had to proceed. The fate of 2 empires depended on this sick girl producing an heir. The wedding night was a medical procedure as much as a royal duty. Physicians stood outside the bedroom door, ready to intervene if Margaret Theresa had a seizure or started choking. Ladies-in-waiting prepared special cushions to support her. Malformed spine. The real horror was still coming. Margaret Theresa got pregnant almost immediately, but her body couldn't handle it. She vomited blood throughout the pregnancy. Her seizures increased to several per day. Her bones, already weak from genetic defects, started breaking under the weight of the baby. She had to be carried everywhere on a special chair because walking caused stress fractures in her feet. Her first child, Ferdinand Wenzel, was born in 1667. He lived for 10 months before dying of convulsions, probably genetic epilepsy. Margaret Theresa was pregnant again within weeks of his death. This second pregnancy was even worse. She developed a condition where she couldn't stop salivating, producing so much saliva that she had to carry cloths to constantly wipe her mouth. The second child, Maria Antonia, was born in 1669 and somehow survived, but the birth nearly killed Margaret Theresa. She hemorrhaged so badly that servants counted 40 blood-soaked sheets. Her seizures during labor were so violent that 4 men had to hold her down. The court physicians privately wrote that they didn't expect her to survive another pregnancy. But Leopold needed more heirs. The Holy Roman Empire required male succession, and his only son had died. Margaret Theresa got pregnant again in 1670, 1671, and 1672. Each pregnancy was worse than the last. Her teeth started falling out from calcium deficiency. Her hair disappeared completely, requiring elaborate wigs. Her bones became so brittle that she broke a rib just from coughing. What happened next changed how Europe understood genetics, though they wouldn't have the science to explain it for another 200 years. Margaret Theresa's children who survived all showed signs of inbreeding. Maria Antonia had the Habsburg jaw. Johann Leopold couldn't speak properly. Maria Anna had seizures. The genetic damage was passing to the next generation. But that wasn't even the worst part. In 1673, Margaret Theresa got pregnant for the 6th time. She was 21 years old, but looked 50. Her body weight had dropped to 70 pounds because she couldn't digest food. Her skin had turned yellow from liver failure. Her physicians begged Leopold to stop impregnating her, but he needed male heirs. This final pregnancy was a medical nightmare. Margaret Theresa couldn't keep any food down. She had to be fed through enemas, which was the 17th century's version of a feeding tube. Her seizures became so frequent that she was unconscious more than awake. Her bones were so fragile that turning over in bed caused fractures. The baby, Maria Theresa, was born prematurely in 1673. The birth was so traumatic that Margaret Theresa's uterus partially came out with the baby, a complete prolapse that required immediate surgery without anesthesia. The court physicians stuffed her uterus back inside and sewed her up with silk thread, all while she screamed in agony. The infection set in within days. Margaret Theresa developed a fever of 104 degrees that wouldn't break. Her abdomen swelled. With pus, the smell became so bad that servants had to burn incense constantly. She started hallucinating, speaking to dead relatives and claiming she could see heaven opening up to receive her. But the real horror was what happened in her final days. The infection spread to her blood, causing sepsis. Her skin turned black in patches as tissue died. Her fingers and toes lost circulation and started rotting while she was still alive. The court physicians tried cutting away the dead flesh, but it spread faster than they could amputate. Margaret Theresa died on March 12, 1673, at age 21. The official cause of death was listed as childbed fever, but the autopsy revealed the true extent of her genetic damage. Her internal organs were malformed. Her bones were hollow like a bird's. Her brain showed signs of multiple strokes. She had been dying since the moment she was conceived. The aftermath was even worse than her death. Of Margaret Theresa's 6 children, only one survived to adulthood, Maria Antonia. She married the Elector of Bavaria and had children, but they all showed signs of inbreeding. The Spanish Habsburg line ended completely when Carlos II died without heirs in 1700, triggering the War of Spanish Succession that killed 400,000 people. What nobody realized at the time was that Margaret Theresa's suffering had been completely preventable. If the Habsburgs had simply married outside their family, she would have been born healthy. Modern geneticists calculate that her inbreeding coefficient was higher than if her parents had been siblings. She was a medical impossibility who somehow lived long enough to pass on her corrupted gene. The Spanish court learned nothing from her death. They continued arranging marriages between uncles and nieces, cousins and cousins. The Austrian Habsburgs lasted until 1740, when Maria Theresa, named after our Margaret, finally started marrying outside the family. By then, the damage was done. The Habsburg dynasty had literally loved itself to death. But that wasn't even the worst part. Margaret Theresa's story became a cautionary tale that nobody heeded. Royal families across Europe continued practicing incest for another century. The British royal family had hemophilia. The Russian Romanovs had hemophilia. The Portuguese royals had mental illness. All from inbreeding. All preventable. All ignored because blue blood mattered more than healthy blood. Today, Margaret Theresa is remembered for Las Meninas, frozen forever as a pretty 5-year-old in a silk dress. Sight tourists admire the painting without knowing they're looking at a dying child, a victim of her family's greed and stupidity. The little princess staring out from the canvas spent her entire life in agony because her ancestors thought their DNA was too precious to share with commoners. The final irony is that Margaret Theresa's suffering accomplished nothing. The Spanish Empire collapsed anyway. The Habsburg dynasty ended anyway. All those uncle-niece marriages, all that genetic damage, all that pain, it was for nothing. Margaret Theresa died at 21, having spent her entire life as a breeding machine for a dying dynasty that couldn't accept its own mortality. Her story proves that power corrupts more than just morals. It corrupts biology itself. The Habsburgs were so obsessed with keeping power within the family that they turned their own children into genetic monsters. Margaret Theresa was their greatest victim, a princess who paid for centuries of incest with every breath she took, every seizure she suffered, every pregnancy that pushed her closer to death. The curse of the Habsburgs wasn't supernatural. It was scientific. It was mathematical. It was the inevitable result of recycling the same DNA over and over until it broke. Margaret Theresa's broken body was the bill coming due for 2 centuries of royal incest, and she paid it in full with her suffering, her pain, and ultimately her life at 21 years old.